Hey guys, so I wanted to make a video for you guys, and this was something that kind of spoke to me the other day. I told you guys I wouldn't just be making videos just for the sake of making a video. This is not about likes or shares or anything like that, but just about sharing something as God kind of lays it on my heart. Um, this was something that God had kind of showed me the other day. I've read this passage a number of times in Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2, but something just based on my circumstances and stuff like that really made this kind of stand out all the more. So when we go to Hebrews 12, we see, he says in verse 1, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." So the first thing that I want to look at there is I want to look at where he talks about that we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. What he's referring to there is he's referring to what he had just got done speaking about in chapter 11. And he talks about how Abraham had was told to leave his land, leave his home, and go and follow God, not being given a specific destination or even a time frame. He was just told to go, and Abraham obeyed. We see that Sarah was promised a child. We see that Abel had offered a sacrifice in faith. And basically what this chapter has become known as is the kind of the Hall of Fame of faith. We see a lot of these instances from Isaac to Moses and all of these individuals, and the writer of Hebrews is basically outlining how faith was exemplified in each one of these guys' lives. But one of the things that I want to kind of point out here is their worldview in this. And by worldview, I'm talking about the worldview of the individuals that he's speaking of. In verse 13, it says, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth." The writer here is basically outlining the fact that all of these individuals who are mentioned, and I encourage you to go and read chapter 11 if you could, to really understand just the sheer number of people who are being mentioned here. But these individuals, their faith was really exemplified in the fact that they weren't waiting necessarily for the fulfillment of what was coming right then and there. For instance, Abraham was promised, a son, but it wouldn't come for many years down the road. He was promised to have a family that would, I think the analogy that was used is that they would rival the stars of heaven, in number, the sands of the sea, and so on and so forth. The point being is that he was promised all of these things, but they didn't come to their full fulfillment in his lifetime. And this is what really kind of demonstrated his faith, is not the fact that, okay, well, I'm going to wait a week, and if God does this for me and stuff, then my faith will be stronger. These people weren't looking for the fulfillment necessarily in this life. Their worldview allowed them to not be fixated on this world, but to be fixated on the world to come. And we see that kind of through some of the things that they went through later on in the chapter. And it talks about in verse 35, it says, "Women having received back their dead received their dead by resurrection." These are women who maybe, their kids are dying, but God doesn't stop them from dying, but he rather resurrects them and brings them back. We see, it says, "Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they may rise again to a better life." Again, we have a tendency to look at faith from the perspective of, well, God is going to rescue me from this trial. But that's not what's being talked about here. These people weren't rescued from the trial. They had to go through the trial. They had to go through the death of a loved one. They had to go through torture, and they refused to be released from this, choosing rather to be associated with God rather than with the pleasures and the comforts of this world. Goes on in verse 36 and says, others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned and were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats and destitute, afflicted and mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. What we see here is we see that the writer of Hebrews is kind of drawing, he's kind of tearing down this modern 21st century view of what faith is. Faith is not necessarily that God is going to, well, I'm just trusting that God is going to rescue me from my circumstances, and he may. But that's not what is being talked about here in a chapter that is specifically devoted to the Hall of Fame of faith for the Bible. We see that these people were not rescued from their problems. We see that they had to go through them, but through faith, they looked for what was going on in the future. And this brings us to chapter 12. So if we read that again, it says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. Well, who's the great cloud of witnesses? Well, it's all those individuals who suffered through everything on earth, looking forward for the kingdom that was to come and having faith that God would bring those things to fulfillment. It says, therefore, since we're surrounded by these guys, let us also lay aside every weight and sin. So one of the things I want you to see here is the distinction between weight and sin. This was the part that really stood out to me and really spoke to me that I wanted to share with you guys. The weight that we have a tendency to look at, or rather, let's address the sin first. So the sin are the things that our hearts are kind of longing for, that God has specifically told us that we should not be doing. It's our sinful nature, it's our sinful flesh that is longing to do some things that we know that we're not supposed to do. But then there's the weight. The weight, he draws a distinction between weight and sin here. And weight is something that is, as he goes on later on and he talks about endurance, weight is something that is weighing us down, that is not necessarily inherently wrong. It's not necessarily inherently evil, but it's not producing anything of benefit either. When endurance runners go on a run, or when special operators go and do missions, one of the things that they do is they pay that extra money for the shoes that are a few ounces lighter. They make sure that they only take what it is that they need and maybe a few things for backup. But every ounce, every pound, everything is important. Anything that I can shed to get that weight off of me will help me in my endurance, which my ultimate endurance in this particular case is to run that race for Christ. As Paul said, that I have finished the race. It's our job to run that race. And one of the things that the writer of Hebrews here is telling us to do is to get rid of any weight that is drawing us down, that is weighing us down, that is hindering us from that. It may or may not even be sin. In this particular case, he's drawn a distinction between sin and this weight. And one of the things that I think about as God has kind of brought me through this journey is, what is it in my life that is producing fruit? What is it that I see God's hand in, and I see him touching others, maybe through me or through my efforts or whatever, for the sake of Christ? If it's something that is just purely comfort, if it's something that is just purely an income, these things are not inherently bad. But if they yield no fruit, again, that worldview looking forward towards the future, if they yield no fruit in that respect, then it could very well be considered a weight. Now, he talks about here, he says, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely to us. This is something that is kind of a core of our identity. I mean, it clings to us. It is wrapping us up. Jesus used the parable of the seed and the sower and stuff, and he talked about how the seed fell on ground and how the weeds came up and choked it out and stuff. And that's kind of the picture that I have here, is that there's this weight, these earthly things that yield no fruit, and then there's this sin which actually competes with our heart, and both of these things are competing with the soil of our heart in trying to obtain nutrients and resources and things like that to produce fruit in our life. He tells us to lay those things aside and to run with endurance the race that is set before us. Now, this is the next part. Looking to Jesus. Because I know once you get to that part and you start evaluating your life, I know it happened to me. You start evaluating your life and you're saying, okay, well, what are these weights in my life? And man, if I cast that off, what am I going to do about this situation? How am I going to handle that? I don't know what to do about this thing and that thing. But the writer of Hebrews has an answer to that. Looking to Jesus. That's his answer. Again, going back to chapter 11 and those individuals who were looking forward to the future, not necessarily looking for a fulfillment in their immediate circumstances right now. They understood that they were going to have to go through trials. They understood that they were going to have difficulty. They understood that the comforts of this world were available to them and were not necessarily inherently sinful. But they preferred what God had promised them in the future to the comforts and the ease of this world. And that's what we're to do. That's what the author of Hebrews is telling us here. Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. One thing I want you to see there is that there is a foundation and then there's a perfection. That this idea of faith that God has sown in our hearts, that seed of the gospel that is growing up within us, this is not something that is just implanted and then that's it. The work is done. This is something that grows. It continues to build. It continues to develop and stuff. But I also want you to see that the author of Hebrews, even though he calls Jesus the founder and perfecter of our faith, he is also giving specific instructions to the individuals. This is what you can do. This is what you should do. Set aside the weight. Set aside the sin. Set aside anything that is competing with the resources in the soil of your heart and walk with endurance the race that is set before you. So he says, looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, okay, the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame. So Jesus, again, the ultimate fulfillment of all these various different actors in the 11th chapter, of all these different kind of exemplifications of faith, Jesus being the pinnacle, the height of that, where Jesus, looking forward to the joy that was on the other side of the cross, endured the persecution, endured the cross, endured everything, because it was what God had called him to do. He set aside everything that could have weighed him down, and he walked with endurance the race that was set before him, the race that God had called for him to walk. So, as we look at this, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy, the future fulfillment that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame. It's not something that Jesus was like, well, God's going to give me warm, fuzzy feelings and stuff in order for me to go through this. He despised the shame. Being put up on the cross was not something that anyone looked forward to, not just because of the physical pain of it, but because of the shame that was exemplified in it. Despising the shame. He didn't want to. In fact, he prayed, Father, take this cup from me. But he surrendered. Nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. And is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. And that's the fulfillment. That's it. That's how it all gets tied together. Jesus, looking forward to the joy, did not see the fulfillment here on this earth, was not rescued from the persecution here on this earth. He went through the trial, went through the persecution, went through the death, was resurrected, and now sits at the right hand of God. So as we sit back and we look at faith and we look at how faith is to be played out in our lives, one of the things that we need to do is realize that there is an element of sovereignty in this, that Jesus is the one who is the founder and the perfecter. I see that perfection as taking place through circumstances that God puts us in, that allows us to start making decisions to choose to continue to walk in faith, to choose to continue to set aside the things of this world. But we also have to realize that while there is an element of sovereignty in here, there is an element of responsibility as well, because the author of Hebrews is specifically telling us these are the things you should do. You should set aside the things that compete with your heart for God, whatever that happens to be. If it is not producing fruit in your life, then it's a weight. If it is something in direct contradiction to what God has called us to, then it's a sin. So we need to ask ourselves, what are those weights and those sins in our life, and how can I set those aside? And if that causes some fear and anxiety in my life, then we're to look to Jesus, who is the founder and the perfecter. And he will support us and he will take care of us. And it doesn't mean that we're not going to have problems, but it does mean that we'll see the fulfillment of those things on the other side. So you guys think about that. God bless.